Every person on today's panel is dedicated to helping people plan for their future. Our specialists are speaking today will cover the care, financial and legal issues, and the practical and emotional support necessary for ageing well. We, as a panel, come together a couple of times a year to host an event, taking guests through an example family situation, showing the pitfalls of failing to prepare and the benefits of planning ahead. And today we'll be highlighting just how we're continuing to support clients during the current restrictions and some of the issues that have arisen in the recent months. If you have any questions as we go through, you might like to add them to the chat button that you'll find at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try and answer as many of your questions as possible at the end of the webinar. So let me introduce the first of our experts. Melanie Meads is the founder of Q1Care Ltd, and Q1 offers domiciliary and living care to elderly and vulnerable people who wish to stay at home. Melanie also runs the Care Hub in Goring, which provides information and access to care and support. So over to you, Melanie.
Many thanks, Alison. As Alison said, I am an independent home care provider, and I deliver care fairly locally in the West Berkshire and South Oxfordshire area around here. I've got a long history of interest in care that started with working in my local care home at the age of 14. I went on to enjoying a rich and varied career in nursing, involving caring for all age groups, from infants to the elderly. I had the opportunity to travel and use my experience there to manage a medical stroke trauma centre in Moscow for 5 years, and then to consult for SOS International on setting up their office over there. But I'd like to fast forward to today, please, and give you an update on what I'm doing now. I believe the best place for your care is in your own home. I focused our company's ethos into delivering individualised, tailor-made care for our clients in the heart of their own communities. We work across the board with all sorts of multidisciplinary specialists, be that GPs, district nurses, hospices, occupational therapists, community mental health care professionals, and obviously our panel here today. Our visits involve anything from meal preparation and light household duties, assistance to getting up, washed, dressed in the morning, ready for the day, to professional support involving the use of a wide range of specialist equipment and moving and positioning techniques. We take our time with our clients, as companionship and emotional well-being is really what it's all about. We can nurture someone's well-being and self-worth, but if we do that, their physical health has got to be improved and their whole outlook must be uplifted. We want to be a high point in our client's day. We look after such a broad spectrum of needs and dependencies. For many, though, I have to say, just being the centre of someone else's universe for an hour is just invaluable. We also pride ourselves on supporting families whose loved ones' life is drawing to a close. Palliative care is a unique and privileged area to work in. We have clients living with long-term chronic illnesses that don't define them, but they need help to carry on enjoying a life as close to their desired normal as possible. The beauty of staying at home is you are able to maintain your familiar surroundings and often have a community network that's already well established, not to mention pets, a garden that you've spent many years nurturing, and a lifetime of collected personal memorabilia. COVID-19 seems to have crystallised the true and vital value of safe care in the home. Where care homes have met some severe challenges, it's proven itself to be a strong alternative, whose profile has actually been raised as a result of this crisis. It's an economically viable alternative. We know care costs are high, irrespective of the route, but the quality of the service we're able to give in the home is truly value added and suits the needs of the individual. Where else would you get one-to-one care other than at home? Whilst there have been PPE challenges, we have managed to maintain a safe and reliable supply of everything needed to deliver support within government guidelines. Early on, just before the government lockdown, we began a recruitment campaign and have successfully onboarded a really rich cross-section of personalities and skills. Interestingly, many of those who applied saw this as a short-term opportunity to remain employed and perhaps to give something back to their local community at the same time. Some of those have discovered the joys of caring for someone else and have chosen to stay long-term. We're an important link to the outside world, and even more so as we start to come out of lockdown. There's a huge amount of anxiety about what life after lockdown looks like, especially for our clientele base, who have already been quite frankly terrified by it. We know we have a trusted and authentic relationship both with our clients and their families, which will enable us to carefully reintroduce them to the outside world. A simple example of this may be their first visit to a supermarket. There's a real skill in social distancing. It's intimidating and quite stressful mixing again with a wider society where there's been 3 months of utter reclusivity. The Hub, which is an outward-facing space for our charitable Q1 Foundation, has jumped in and managed the community helpline and worked with 800 plus street champions to wrap around the vulnerable in our very local community, including our more rural residents. We've initiated a mask-making scheme of volunteers to both protect our neighbours and raise valuable funds for the foundation. These funds will be channelled into focusing on life after lockdown in our villages. It will never be the same again, especially for our more senior residents. I hope to take some of the fear away and work out ways to reduce, if not annihilate, that feeling of isolation, which is being ferociously amplified by the current crisis. We know that the dependency on IT social media channels have kept a lot of us sane, but there are many for whom this is also a terrifying new world. To conclude, we feel the future may be daunting, but we have positive and creative, safe solutions to help continue to support and give confidence to our vulnerable local residents living in the local area. Thank you very much. I'd now like to introduce you to Kate, who's going to follow on from me and discuss financial matters. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much, Melanie. I am a chartered financial planner and independent financial advisor, and I run the Newbury office of Shaw Financial Planning. I have nearly 20 years experience in this industry. I'm very proud of my accreditation by the Society of Later Life Advisors, known as SOLA. They insist on a broad knowledge of later life. That is anybody who is 50 years or older, building up to and then planning retirement through to the later years of life. This included a 2-hour Viva and some extensive assessment. But what I love about SOLA is, as well as looking at specialist care funding, they also place high regard for supporting legal framework, the benefit system, and they take a very holistic approach. For example, some of my wealthy clients often assume that they will receive no help at all, whereas actually there are means-tested entitlements that they may qualify for, such as attendance allowance, which could be £4,500 a year tax-free. And I guess every little helps, as the numbers will follow shortly. So during the COVID crisis, I have supported several families who've sadly reached that crisis in their healthcare planning. Whilst I feel a professional and moral responsibility to help clients prepare themselves financially for later life, those who actually take my advice, document their wishes and structure their finances are usually far more effective in reducing their stress at a really difficult time. This then allows them to focus on adjustments to their day-to-day living, both emotionally and physically. So some of the costs of care are quite large. They do vary according to your physical and emotional needs, the amount of supervision required, and they also vary dramatically geographically. But we had a conversation earlier on today. This is myself and my other colleagues today, and we were talking about how much the cost of care has gone up during COVID, and we estimate that it's gone up by something around the 20% mark. So, as very much averages, we would anticipate a carer visiting somebody at home 4 times a day for an hour each visit could be around £45,000 a year. Live-in care has increased as well. We think roughly around 52,000. and nursing home costs have gone up to something like £65,000 a year, although I reiterate, it does depend on the amount of care needed. If close nursing is required, that nursing home cost of £65,000 a year could be considerably more. The Alzheimer's Society pre-COVID estimated the cost of care for somebody suffering with Alzheimer's could be £100,000. And the only other point I want to add at this point is that I'm sure Melanie and Alison will testify, continuing healthcare support where your care is paid for you due to specific care needs is fairly few and far between, because quite frankly local authorities cannot afford to do this, and it would also be a strain on the NHS. So my best plan of action: please, please, please tell your nearest and dearest what you want to happen, what your first preference would be, and if it is to stay at home, please plan for that. Please review all of your existing savings and investments and take advice in terms of how to structure them to support your ideal choice of retirement living. Review your financial plans annually. Again, I'm sure my colleagues will testify, you put plans in place, they will change, they will vary. Your thoughts, your wishes, your wants, they will all vary with time, but have a plan in place so that you can tweak it rather than, you know, when the time comes, having complete pandemonium as you try and drag together plans and the money to support it. My next point was going to be have plans in place ready to press the button if the situation occurs. And document your accounts, your investments, your professional advisors, and how to get in touch with them in a crisis situation. Then use people like Penny and Tara to support with legal powers to manage money and care decisions. And my final point, I'm often asked about whether to put assets in children's names, commonly the main residence. And the purposes for this are often to try and avoid paying for nursing care. And sometimes it's related to inheritance tax as well. But quite frankly, doing this could be regarded by the local authority as what's called deprivation of assets, which is a direct action to try and avoid using your own money to pay for care. I have had a solicitor quote a case where the local authority went back to a transaction that happened 14 years before the assessment. And what then happened was that the children who had the benefit of the house then were asked to essentially pay for their parents' care. And of course, don't forget that if you put your house in your children's names or partially in your children's names, and they go through a divorce or they pass away themselves, it is their asset and it will be dealt with as per the terms of the divorce or their will. So there is an awful lot more I could have covered. This is just a very brief overview. So I'm going to hand over now to Penny Wright from Gardner Leader Solicitors, who will talk you through powers of attorney. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. So I'm Penny, I'm a solicitor. I'm going to cover the legal aspects of helping an incapacitated person. In making arrangements to care for your loved one, you need to have suitable legal authority to access their money and make decisions on their behalf. The way to achieve this is to have a lasting power of attorney in place. Lasting powers of attorney are documents that you sign, usually in advance of needing them, which authorise one or more people to manage things on your behalf if you become incapable. So if the person you're helping has already made the power of attorney, then it's quite straightforward for the attorney to get on with managing everything. But if the person's not already made a power of attorney and has already lost capacity, then it's too late to make one. There is another way of dealing with it, but it's not as flexible and it can work out much more expensive and time-consuming in the long run. So it's much better, if you can, to think ahead, like Kate says. Think ahead, make sure that powers of attorney are in place well before they're needed. I recommend them to everybody, regardless of age, because you never know when you might have an illness or an accident leaving you incapacitated. There are two types of lasting power of attorney. One that covers decisions about your property and finances, and the other covering decisions about your health and welfare. The property and financial affairs power of attorney allows the attorneys to deal with your bank accounts, to pay your bills, to manage your investments and pensions and other things. It can also empower the attorney to sell your house if necessary, for example, to move you to something more suitable, or to sell it and invest the proceeds to pay for whatever care you need. The health and welfare power of attorney is different. So that enables the attorneys to make decisions regarding medical treatment and anything to do with your personal welfare. So, for example, consenting or refusing consent to medical treatment, which might be decisions about whether you should be resuscitated, whether you should receive life-sustaining treatment, or it might be more mundane day-to-day decisions. The power of attorney form can include your preferences, for example, about what types of treatment you would or wouldn't want to have and what you would want your attorney to do or not to do on your behalf. Both these aspects are very important, so it's advisable to have both types of power of attorney. The attorneys don't necessarily have to be the same for both types of power of attorney. For example, somebody who's good at managing money might not be the person that you want making decisions about your medical treatment, or vice versa. So it's very flexible. You can have different people for those different roles, and you can also name replacements who can step in if your first named people can't do it. Guided, we help by advising and preparing the powers of attorney and making sure that we include appropriate wording to ensure that the attorney's path is as smooth as possible. I'm now going to hand over to Tara, who's going to talk about some legal aspects relating to wills. Tara.
Thank you, Penny. So as Penny said, I work within the Disputed Wills and Trust team in Shoesmith Solicitors, and that's all I deal with. So Penny drafts the wills, and sadly, on the rare occasion where those wills are disputed or challenged, then that's a very niche area that I deal with. And I don't want to scare people, so I am going to talk about ways that you can prevent people challenging your will. But today I am going to talk to you about the problems that the recent lockdown and the pandemic have caused with regards to both people making wills and people bringing challenges against wills, and how I envisage that this will result in an increase in will challenges in the future. So I'm not saying don't make a will, and hopefully I'll give you some ways of making sure that your will isn't challenged. So to start off with, I'll explain how the grounds on which a will can be challenged. First of all, a will can be challenged if it doesn't comply with the formalities of the Wills Act. So essentially, I mean, there are quite a lot of formalities there, but essentially it needs to be in writing. A person needs it to be intended to be a will, and it needs to be witnessed by two independent people who must see the will maker sign the will, and then they must sign the will as well. If a will is challenged because it doesn't comply with the formalities of the Wills Act or on one of the other grounds, then the will not be valid, and your estate will pass either according to an earlier will, if you have one, or under the rules of intestacy if you have no earlier will. So clearly that wouldn't be what the will maker would have intended. A will can be challenged or the grounds of lack of testamentary capacity. So if the person making the will doesn't fully understand, they don't have the capacity to understand that they're making a will, if they're under the influence of drugs or alcohol, or if they suffer with a disease which impacts on their cognitive abilities. The will can be challenged on the grounds of lack of knowledge and approval of a will. So in a nutshell, the will maker doesn't really understand the will and what the will says. It's usually where there's a long, complicated will, where it's difficult to understand, or where there are homemade wills and there are lots of errors and mistakes in the will, and where somebody who assists, who's instrumental in the preparation of the will, inherits under the will. The court regards that as being suspicious circumstances, and the will's more open to challenge. Undue influence. So I do get a lot of clients coming to me saying, oh, I think my father or mother or whoever has been unduly influenced. So it is mentioned a lot by people, but actually it's a very difficult will challenge to bring. So you have to show that somebody has unduly influenced the will maker into making the will or into making provision for that person. There needs to be some degree of coercion in order to get by on undue influence. So influence isn't enough. We're all influenced into making decisions and making a will. It actually needs to be more than just influence, coercion, or fraud. And that takes us on to the fifth grounds for challenging a will, which is, of course, forgery of fraud, which naturally speaks for itself. If somebody's forged a will, or they've fraudulently obtained a signature to a will, then the will can be challenged and set aside. One that we see a bit more, we've seen a bit more recently, is fraudulent calumny. Now, that's where somebody who inherits under a will or doesn't inherit under a will has essentially poisoned the will maker's mind into excluding another person, and those whispers or comments are not true. So maybe one child has poisoned their mother's mind against another child by making false accusations that that child has stolen from the mother. So that's fraudulent calumny. As a result of both the pandemic itself and the lockdown, I do foresee that there will be an increase in challenging wills. And the reason for this, going back through the grounds for challenge, are that first of all, in respect of the lack of formalities, the Wills Act is very prescriptive in terms of what constitutes a valid will. In England and Wales, you need to have two witnesses witness the will. They don't actually have to physically be in the same room as the person writing the will, making the will, but they do need to be able to see the will maker sign that will. And I've heard some very inventive stories about solicitors who have managed to get round the social distancing aspect of that to have the will witnessed. So the witnesses, they don't need to know the contents of the will, but they need to know that it's a will. And you shouldn't have somebody who you're leaving a legacy to in your will witness your will, because that will invalidate their legacy. Obviously, as I said, the difficulties with the lockdown are that people are possibly a little bit worried to go out to see a solicitor, get their will dealt with properly, and maybe there are more homemade wills being made during lockdown, which are more likely to be open to challenge. In terms of testamentary capacity, that's also a concern in the current circumstances, because as I said, where a solicitor meets a will maker, the solicitor will ensure, using their experience, that the will maker has sufficient capacity to make the will. And there are various things that they need to be able to understand in order to have that capacity. Where they have concerns about capacity, then they would arrange for a GP or medical expert to provide a report to make sure that that was all complied with. Where we're in lockdown again, there are homemade wills. People might not be so alert to the possibility of a lack of capacity. There might have been a delay if a solicitor prepared the will initially in it being signed, and again, capacity can diminish in that period of time. And then, of course, there's the pandemic itself. COVID-19 is a respiratory infection which can cause, it can result in a loss of oxygen to the brain, which in itself can impact on a person's capacity. Coupled with the psychological impacts, as we've heard our other talkers discuss, about social isolation, maybe somebody's died, and grief in itself can cause a lack of capacity. Coupled with all of those, you can see how those types of challenges might increase in the future. With regards to knowledge and approval of a will, as I've already said several times, where there's a homemade will, there's likely to be a lack of compliance with the formalities of the Wills Act, and where somebody's instrumental in preparing that will and they inherit, then again, those are suspicious circumstances. So in the lockdown situation where people are at home, there might be more homemade wills, there might be more people asserting influence and getting a will prepared where they inherit. So I think that is going to increase in those types of challenges. Turning to undue influence, vulnerable people are more likely to be subject to undue influence, especially where they've been shut off from their friends and family members for extended periods of time, and perhaps they're actually in lockdown with a family member who's shielding with them but might be taking advantage of them financially. So that's something to bear in mind. Forgery and fraud, again, where we have the isolation, more likely to be on the increase. And fraudulent calumny, which is an interesting one, where you're in lockdown with a person who is poisoning somebody's mind against another family member, then there's going to be less interference from the outside world. So I do see possibly that those types of claims will increase as a result of the lockdown. So on a slightly happier note, so what can you do to make sure that those challenges don't occur against either yours or a loved one's will? Well, thankfully, most solicitors are taking steps to ensure that the wills that they prepare are being witnessed correctly. And you know, as I said, I've heard some very inventive stories about people going around and witnessing wills in porches, drive-throughs, and through windows. So again, you should still be making wills, you should still be taking legal advice. If a homemade will has been prepared during lockdown, then again, provided it's all done properly, a homemade will can still be valid. So that's still not a bad thing, but I would suggest that's viewed as a temporary measure. And then maybe when you are able to get out and about more, then you make a proper will to make sure that it is valid. Where you do have concerns about a person's capacity to make a will, then consider whether a statutory will is possible. So where somebody loses capacity, but they have an estate or a large property, it might be worth making an application to the Court of Protection to make sure that they have a will in place rather than an intestacy. And where you're concerned about a friend or family member maybe being subjected to undue influence or financial abuse, then you can raise these concerns either with the local authority, if there's a safeguarding issue, or with a solicitor. And you can actually report to the police if there's theft or fraud, although in my experience, the police tend not to get involved in these types of disputes. But again, where there is quite clearly theft or fraud, then that is a criminal offence. So none of the issues that I've mentioned today are insurmountable, provided the person is still alive and still able to get access to legal assistance when we come out of lockdown. The problems really start to occur if they're not able to get that legal assistance. So all I'm really trying to say, rather than scaring people, is that you should go out, make sure that you do take the appropriate advice and just make sure that everything is in order. And if there are any concerns or problems with regards to a will dispute or challenge, then I am able to assist. And I'm going to pass over now on a slightly happier note to Alison Hesketh from Timefinders. Alison.
Thank you, Tara. As Tara just said, I'm Alison Hesketh and I'm from Timefinders, and we're senior life specialists who really bridge the gap between the legal and financial professions and the care sector. We do that by providing practical help and emotional support to older people in changing circumstances. And what could be a more changing circumstance than the COVID-19 lockdown? The enforced isolation of lockdown will have given many elderly people a very uncomfortable opportunity to discover that their home is not necessarily suitable for them to live in for the rest of their days. And we're seeing an increase in the number of clients looking to downsize. Downsizing itself can be a very emotional and exhausting process, and it needs a lot of very practical, sensitive and patient help to help somebody make a successful transition to a new home. Living in the right place at the right time, whether that means moving or staying put and adapting your home to make it more manageable, is essential for maintaining as much independence and control in later life as you possibly can. Moving away from one's community, where you may have lived for quite a number of years, perhaps to be nearer to family members, is something to contemplate very, very carefully. And Timefinders can help clients consider, all the options and some of the pitfalls to avoid. The importance of good friends and an active social network should never be underestimated. It's incredibly important for somebody's mental well-being. And when you're moving to a new community, you're leaving that existing network behind. It's also very important to manage expectations, particularly if you're moving closer to a family member, because it's very easy to have misunderstandings, which may start off as being really kind of trivial irritations, but can grow into something that can be quite difficult. So it's important for everybody to be realistic and honest. Will somebody pop in regularly to see you for coffee? If so, roughly how often? You might think often is a couple of times a week. Somebody might think quite often is a couple of times a month. You know, are you expecting family members to offer to give you physical care? Do your children want you to babysit? Again, if so, how often and for how long? Are they going to go off on holiday and leave you looking after the grandchildren? And if you are leaving your community and you've been active in your social network, how do you feel about making a new community in the new place where you live? How do you feel about going along to the local WI or the book club, bowls, choir, church, whatever is your interest now? How do you feel about doing that on your own? Many people move closer to a family member because they've suffered a bereavement and they've lost their partner in life. And sometimes with that grief comes a lack of confidence. And that lack of confidence can make it very difficult for somebody to bounce into a completely new set of people and say, hello, I've just arrived. It can be very difficult to make those steps. So you've got to think about very carefully how you're going to make a social network outside your family. Will you miss your friends? How will you keep in touch? Will you be lonely? These are all very important questions to consider if you're thinking about leaving your community. But not everybody needs to move. And a lot of people want to stay put, and they can adapt their home to future-proof it for life, so that you know that you can stay where you are for as long as you live. And staying in a familiar setting is particularly important for somebody who's just been diagnosed or is living with dementia. And I would like to reiterate, you know, Melanie's point, because care in your own home is absolutely possible, and with good professional care in your own home, it's perfectly possible for most people living with dementia to stay there in their own home until the end of their days. More and more of our clients are aging alone, and their isolation during lockdown has been particularly difficult. We've developed an advocacy service which can provide an alternative to a health and welfare attorneyship for people who have nobody to appoint. And we found that we've been able to adapt this during lockdown, so we can, instead of providing face-to-face meetings, we can gather the information that we need in order to act on somebody's behalf. We can do that over the phone or by, you know, Zoom conversations. And that's provided a great deal of peace of mind for people who have nobody to make sure their voice is heard, particularly when it comes to health and care matters. We've also been helping family members who are property and financial affairs attorneys, where there is no health and welfare attorneyship in place, to provide advocacy for their loved ones where they're finding it difficult to manage and source appropriate care. We also have a number of clients living in residential care, and it's been very interesting to compare the differing levels of information and support that have been given not only to residents but also to family members and to us as advocates. Residential care communities have been particularly badly hit by COVID-19, and visits to most of our clients have been prohibited. They're just now beginning, you know, the restrictions are just now beginning to be lifted, but visiting is still very difficult to arrange, and we're certainly not able to visit people as many times as we would normally be able to do. Many care homes have tried really hard, and they've succeeded in helping to support their residents to keep in contact via a video calling. But many people with dementia have found this very difficult to grasp. They've never done it before. This is something new. They're already anxious because they're not seeing their family members or their professional advisors as regularly as they would normally do, and they found it very difficult to manage. We've resorted to old-fashioned letter writing with our clients, enclosing photographs of the towns and places where they grew up, you know, maybe from the 1950s and 60s, so that there is some point of recognition, some point of contact, that when we do telephone them, we have something interesting and fun to talk about. Obviously, the pandemic has highlighted areas which need improvement, and I think universally free Wi-Fi available in all care homes is a must. And I'm sure that it will come as a result of people's experience over the last 3 months, because virtually nobody foresaw or planned for a pandemic. But it's not all bad news. On the plus side, professional advisors have adapted their services so that they can work at a distance and still provide the same level of support and expertise as they have always done. You know, the COVID-19 outbreak has forced many reluctant people to actually explore the amazing possibilities of the internet for the first time in a safe way. And it's actually leapfrogged the use of technology by the older generation that was expected by the experts to take, you know, at least another 10 years, if not 15 years. So we've got clients who've now been, you know, virtually able to visit museums and gardens, to listen to the great performances from opera houses and concert halls from around the world, you know, virtually go to the Glastonbury Festival, attend services and religious ceremonies. That's provided a huge amount of comfort for some of our clients when they've been unable to go to church. You know, and not to mention, you know, the fabulous webinars and online courses, all sorts of things that have come about. And that's never going to go away. That's something that they have now. That's a really positive outcome. Of course, COVID-19 has brought its problems and its tragedies. And there are very many questions that are going to have to be properly asked and properly answered so that we can be better prepared to meet the challenges of the second wave or for any new virus that is likely to come along. And that brings me back to future planning. It is never, ever, ever too early to start planning, whatever your circumstances, to plan ahead. And plans, like Kate said, don't have to be written in stone. They can be adapted. But if you have a plan and it is written down and people know your wishes and know what you want to happen, they can help you have the best life in later years. A good plan takes account of all possible changes and adaptations which might need to be made, and it involves all your professional advisors working together for you. So now I'm going to hand back to Michaela, who I think has been collecting some of the questions that you've been sending in. Michaela.
Thank you. Yes, we have received some questions, but if anyone would like to, just to reiterate, if you missed the start, we can't hear you as attendees or we can't see you. So there is a chat function, there's a Q&A function, so please do submit any questions you have. A lot of these questions will be relevant to a lot of you, so please do listen in. So I'll just pull some up. So my first question is for Melanie. What is your one piece of advice you would give people considering their choice of care? You're just on mute, Melanie, if you wouldn't mind unmuting. Sorry, it's a habit to get into, I think.
Thank you, thank you. That's an easy one to answer. My first piece of advice would be to consider planning for staying at home and having care at home. I feel very strongly that's for the majority of people, not for 100% of people, but for the majority of people, that is the ideal way forward. And I'd also reiterate what Alison said about thinking about it early. A lot of the people that come to me wind up coming to me when they're already in crisis, and it's a real panic getting everything started, and they're very anxious, and everything's done as a slightly knee-jerk reaction. Whereas if they'd actually started building a loose, slightly relaxed relationship with us maybe a year before, even if we were just coming in and doing some light domestic duties and a bit of companionship, then when things have changed, we're already in there and we're familiar to them, so it's much easier to ramp up what's required in a shorter term, because we already have a lot of knowledge of that person first. So I would say thinking about it early, as Alison said, and planning to stay at home.
My next question is for Kate. So how will, the pandemic affect people's savings, investments, and, financial assets?
Thank you, Michaela. So firstly, the first thing I would really like to say is please don't panic. To look at the savings first, interest rates are probably going to stay historically low for the very foreseeable future. I fully recommend everybody sets aside an emergency fund. And if you are taking an income from your investments, all of my clients have 2 years of that investment income set aside in cash. At the moment, I've suspended most of their income payments and they're living off that cash until such times as the market stabilise. That said, most of my clients are within 3 to 5% of their original sort of their values pre-COVID. As long as you're in a very well diversified portfolio that fits well within your attitude and appetite for risk, and it's well diversified, you should be fine. And of course, by the end of next year, you'll probably, the volatility will probably have stabilized, you know, to a far better degree. We may just be looking at, you know, 2 years of sort of from where you were to the beginning of this year to the end of next year, you'll probably be maybe just about the same place. But we're really not panicking because we're quite confident in the process we have for our clients. If you haven't got an advisor, you may want to, at this point, get a second opinion.
Thank you. I've got quite a few questions coming in now, so I'll just try get as many answered as possible. One for Penny: how does an LPA affect my will?
A power of attorney is a different thing from a will, because a power of attorney only applies whilst you're alive, and the moment that you die, your power of attorney ceases to have any effect and your will takes over. So they are different. Ideally you prepare both and keep both up to date, but they do cover very different circumstances. Your attorneys under your lasting power of attorney cannot change your will. They can make an application to court for a new will to be drawn up, as Tara mentioned earlier, but that would be that's not the normal thing to do. That would just be in exceptional circumstances.
I've got a question for Tara here. Can a will be challenged by someone who feels they've been excluded as a beneficiary?
So, as I said, you can only challenge a will on the grounds that I've mentioned earlier. So you can only challenge a will if there's actually something wrong with the will. You can't just challenge it because you don't like the fact that it leaves everything to one of your siblings. But what you might be able to do is bring a claim under a piece of legislation called the Inheritance Provision for Family and Dependents Act. So if you're eligible, which an adult child would be, a spouse would be, a cohabitee would be, and you need maintenance, there's a financial need there, you might be able to bring a claim against the estate, but you can't just challenge the will if you're not happy with what it says.
Okay. One for Alison now. What types of issues have you been experiencing, or your clients have been experiencing, particularly as a result of the pandemic?
Undoubtedly isolation and loneliness. It's been very interesting to us for those clients who have got a community around them. As I mentioned earlier, many of our clients are aging alone. They don't have family. And even if that family lived close by, you know, under COVID lockdown, people have been prevented from visiting other family members. But so to an extent, everybody's been aging alone. But many of our clients really are aging alone. They don't have family. And those that have developed a community network have survived in much better shape than those that haven't. There are many reasons why people don't connect with their community, but I think it's been really brought home to them during this period that they are completely alone. Clients that have got good community relations, you know, with their neighbours, with their, you know, with their local streets, have participated in socially distanced coffee mornings where people have shouted, you know, good wishes across the road to their neighbours, have found that neighbours have clustered around and have offered them, you know, online shopping opportunities, have collected things for them, have delivered things for them. So they've survived much better. So I think those are some lessons to take into a post-COVID world, is that community is incredibly important. And if you cut yourself off from that community, you can be left very isolated, and that has dramatic effects on your mental well-being. And in fact, as Melanie mentioned earlier, if your mental well-being is suffering, then your physical well-being can suffer as well. And I think Melanie mentioned that she'd seen more people coming to her who are, again, lonely and isolated, who are suffering more falls. You know, and falls can have a devastating effect on your mobility and on your independence as you grow older. So yeah.
Thank you. I've got a question for Melanie from the chat, so thank you to the attendee that sent this one in. If you're Does Q1Care offer live-in care if concerned about different carers coming into the house each time? So I guess how is Q1Care, handling that and social distancing? That's probably the best way. Sorry, you're on mute again.
Getting better, it's a bit slow. That's a really good question. We have really noticed a marked increase in inquiries about live-in care. People are definitely concerned about having multiple carers come in. If we have someone who requires perhaps 4 visits a day, you can't have one carer working 7 days a week going into someone's house for 4 visits a day. So by default, you're going to have more people visiting. And there are quite a few people who've clocked that if they have a living carer in there, they have a consistency of one person, our little guest speaker there, one person who is almost sort of bubbling, seeing as that's the word at the moment, bubbling with them, which gives their families a lot of reassurance as well, that they just have the one person without multiple people coming through, increasing that risk of being introduced to something from the outside. And as I said earlier, the other reason, when I was talking about earlier about the fact that actually this whole crisis has really put the spotlight on care in the home, we've also had quite a lot of interest from people in residential homes who want to move their loved ones out, which is that we're just in the process of risk assessing how we can assist with doing that, because obviously we have to be careful about our carers going in and visiting multiple clients and making sure we don't develop some kind of chain where we have a typhoid Mary who winds up by just carrying COVID around and giving it to everybody. So it's interesting how we've never had inquiries before about people coming out of residential support and into domiciliary care. It's always been a natural progression in my experience that people have home care and eventually they feel that maybe it isn't giving them what they need and they'll move the other way. So live-in, I think, is a really, really viable alternative to both dom care and residential care.
Thank you. I've got another question here. It's directed at Tara, but I think it might be Penny and Tara. Given the huge advancements in digital technology, do you believe that wills, living wills and video wills may become the norm, utilising similar witness processes and a digital timestamp? I thought it was quite interesting. So.
Well, that's a can of worms, isn't it? You raised that question. So I'll leave Penny to deal with the aspect of living wills, but if the question is suggesting that in the future we might be able to have video wills and maybe electronic signing of wills, I mean, that is quite a contentious topic. And when lockdown happened, I think people were hoping there might be a relaxation of the Wills Act, which dates from 1837, so it is pretty out of date. Actually, though, there hasn't been any kind of relaxation of the rules. I know that in some places, such as Jersey and Australia and places like that, they have relaxed their rules as to witnessing wills and some of the formalities, but the Law Society hasn't as of yet, and possibly in the future there might be a degree of relaxation. I mean, we're in 2020, but currently that wouldn't be a valid will. So do you have anything to add to that, Penny?
Yeah, I do, in that, because I prepare wills and I supervise them being executed very regularly, and I always want to see my client in person and sit down and talk them through it. And I think to do that over a video link is very, very difficult, because it's really hard to judge whether they've really understood it properly, and it's very hard to assess their mental capacity remotely. And actually, as Tara said earlier, we found lots of ways of witnessing wills and talking to clients, from their back garden through an open window or doorway at a safe distance. So we can still do it that way, so that there isn't a need to do it over a video link. Once you're with the client in their house, not in their house, but in their garden, you can get a much better feel for whether they are really doing it of their own free will, that whether there are other people around who might be telling them what to do or what to say, which you just can't see from a little screen. So I think there's a lot of danger.
Sorry, I think it might be good evidence in a potential future claim, if you had a video of the will maker of their own free volition saying what their intentions were, it might support a claim, it might support a will challenge, it might support an Inheritance Act claim, but it will not be a valid will.
Perfect. Okay, moving along. Another question here, one for Penny. Top tips to start preparing a power of attorney. So I guess what's the process to start?
The starting point would be to talk to your solicitor about it. If you don't have a solicitor already that you talk to about these sorts of things, then make sure that whoever you choose is properly specialist in this sort of thing and that understands the issues. It will be slightly different depending on whether you're preparing a power of attorney for yourself, in which case you go and talk to your solicitor about it. If people that come to me about it, I give them a free initial meeting. We just talk through in general terms what they're trying to achieve, who they might appoint, and so on, and we can take it from there. If you're thinking about starting the process of preparing a power of attorney for somebody else, so on behalf of your elderly mother or whatever it is, it's slightly more difficult, perhaps if they're in hospital, for example, already. We can't go and visit them in person. That's a challenge at the moment, but if they're isolating at home, we can arrange, for me to go and speak to them through their open doorway or window, and get the process started that way. But like with wills, it's much better to do this face to face if at all possible. So somebody local to the person who's making the power of attorney, I think, is really important.
I've got one for Alison. In your opinion, how common is it for social services or the NHS to step in and say that a patient can't return to their own home?
I did some research on this a little while ago. It's actually very, very difficult to find anybody who's going to give you any answers. We know, I suppose you'd call it anecdotal evidence, that we've had families come to us in crisis to say something like, mum's fallen over, she's broken her hip, social services have come in and said that she can't go home. And I suppose that must have happened about 6 or 7 times, probably in about the same number of years. But obviously we're quite a small company and we're only operating in a small area, so this might happen. I do know there was some research done by the BBC a couple of, well, actually probably more like 8 years ago now. The number of people who would remained in hospital because they were awaiting social services to do a care assessment and to allow them back into the community, and that can take months, and people can be trapped in hospital for months. And this is where the likes of Melanie can come in, where we can come in and we can say we can do a private, but if they are self-funding, so social services wouldn't be paying for their care, we can come in if they've got capacity or if there's a health and welfare attorney in place to organise a care assessment very quickly and to get that support necessary. I think in the past there has been a blink of view from social services. Any social workers listening, will probably correct me on this, but I think there has been a view that getting somebody who's elderly and frail into residential care is absolutely the right thing for them. I think I have issues with the way that those people have been transitioned into that environment and leaving their own home behind, and I think that it can make for a very uncomfortable and not a very successful transition. It comes down to whether you've got capacity, whether there's a health and welfare attorney in place, or whether you have an advocate. And I think, going back to the solicitors here, they'll back me up, that the phrase next of kin doesn't have any legal bearing whatsoever. You can be somebody's next of kin, but you do not have a right to say what's going to happen about that person's care on your own if there's no health and welfare, if you don't hold health and welfare attorneyship. Even if they're your long-standing partner or they're your sainted mother, you as next of kin, you don't have a right. And when you consider that you might have siblings, So you might be one of 4 children. You're all next of kin, you're all equal next of kin. You may have very different ideas about that person's care. And so who is social services going to listen to? So it's another reason why a health and welfare attorneyship is really, really important. You should have a best interest panel decision, and that can take time to organise, which should include you as a next of kin and all your other next of kin and all that other person's next of kins. But this is a big bureaucratic process, and it can take time. And sometimes hospital isn't the right place for somebody to be, and they need to be in a better care environment, whether that is a residential care or it's back in their own home with good live-in or domiciliary care. So I probably haven't quite answered your question, but it's raised an important point about the importance of not just having a financial LPA, but also having a health and welfare one too.
Thank you.
Can I just throw something in?
Definitely. Definitely.
I would say actually it's quite rare. It's relatively rare when I come across perhaps a client of mine going into hospital and then the social services coming in and saying they can't come back to our care. What I do see often is the complete opposite actually. So I'll have a new or established client who's in hospital, and the challenge that I have of getting them out is trying to convince the hospital that there is good care in place for them to come home. And so I can find that it's very often it's me individually, I myself sitting in front of you, that has to go in and talk to the people on the ward and say what it is I can deliver, what I have in place, and can these people please come home. So meanwhile, they're sort of sitting in a hospital, which if we talk about someone who's perhaps got memory issues or is living with dementia, it's a completely inappropriate place for them to be. I've got personal experience of that. I know it's awful what it does to them. So it's interesting that my concerns with social services and getting people out of hospital sometimes, but not because they're trying to get them out of hospital and move them into residential, but they're just making it quite difficult actually for them to come out of hospital at all and go anywhere. Actually.
And the converse of that is the discharge team just getting them out without a proper care plan being in place.
And that's the opposite when they come home to us at 12:30 at night without us being told they're coming home. And we've had that happen to us quite often actually as well. Yeah. That's a communication thing, isn't it? I suppose, Alison, you know, it's just, there's poor planning and poor communication. Yeah, we have been on receiving end of that several times as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I've got a question here for Penny. How can I make an appointment during lockdown for my elderly relative? She needs to amend her will and prepare an LPA.
Well, yes, you can make an appointment. What I would probably start with is arranging to go and, as I say, talk to your elderly relative from a safe distance in their garden initially. Have a chat with them about what they want, and then we can take it from there.
Are you using other methods to speak with people at the moment?
Yeah, we are. So for an initial chat, I'm happy to do that over video conference, and I've been doing that a lot lately. As I say, it is better to talk face to face, particularly when you come to the point of signing. But either a home visit or a video conference initially is fine.
Pick a day with a nice weather forecast.
Yeah, I've done this under an umbrella, but I didn't like it much.
I've got one here for Kate. Can immediate needs annuity payments be made to professional carers looking after people in their own homes? Oh, you're muted, Kate, sorry.
Sorry, I thought I was used to this by now. Yeah, basically it can, but I've had a look through some terms and conditions yesterday just to make sure I was fully up to date. And it, literally it is a registered care provider. And I would also say, look, I don't know what Melanie would think to this, but I think I'd want to know that my care provider was registered with the CQC. I would be really concerned if it was just, I know this has happened historically where somebody from the village is really good and they just come in and great, but if you need care, I think I want my carer registered with the Care Quality Commission.
Okay. Can people look on their website or something to check the registration, or do you know? Yep. Yeah. Okay.
Yep. All self-respecting care services companies should have a website, and it should be clearly plastered all over the front page what their CQC rating is. And if it's not there, then you need to ask questions. Why not?
Fantastic. I think we've covered a lot of questions. If anyone has any last minute urgent ones, I think pop them quickly in the Q&A, otherwise we might draw to a close now. Of course, you can contact any of the panelists. You know, their details will be on kind of a email and anything like that, but if you do have any final questions, please do pop them in. And thank you so much to our panel today, Melanie Meads, Kate Talbot, Penny Wright, Tara and Alison. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
all.
you.